Hi, this is Emma Bell, and welcome to the Inside Shift podcast.
I'm delighted to have Suzanne Lachmann on the Inside Shift podcast today. Suzanne is a New York State licensed clinical psychologist with offices in Manhattan and Westchester, New York. Suzanne earned her doctorate from the Furkow Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. Suzanne's work has been featured in USA Today, in Time, in Cosmo, in Women's Health, in Men's Health, and elsewhere. Suzanne blogs at psychologytoday.com. Now, Suzanne works in her offices and via phone with both male and female adult and late adolescent patients who have got complex, including relationship issues, trauma, struggles with self-esteem, body image, trust, depression, and anxiety. But here's one hugely interesting fact, and that is that since 9/11, Suzanne has served as a consulting psychologist for the Fire Department of New York. Suzanne, welcome to the Inside Shift podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, Emma.
We're delighted to have you. And we always start the podcast, Suzanne, by asking our guests this question. What's the most impactful inside shift that you've made in your own life? Tell us about that.
I so appreciate that question and have thought about it and sort of rolled it over in my mind. And of course, for anyone, there's many impactful shifts in their lives that occur, whether they intend for that to happen or if it just sort of happens to them or around them. And for me, like for so many people across the world, 9/11 was a huge change, emotionally, physically, mentally, especially I'd say sort of being in the backyard of where it happened, when it happened. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more, if you don't mind, about how it shifted you mentally, emotionally?
Well, I was working at the time and living maybe a mile north of towers that were nearly a mile high. And so throughout the day that day, and for the many days and weeks and months and years that followed, the amount of first responder and military activity flying over our heads, whizzing by us as they worked their way down to the southernmost tip of Manhattan, which was in utter disarray. And the smell that wafted throughout New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, the tri-state area, all of the boroughs, the smell, to this day, I'll never forget it. And I remember while watching the footage, we were all privy across the world, or whomever had TVs, to tons of footage of the devastation, tons of footage of everything happening repeatedly in slow motion, in fast motion, you name it, we all could see it. And being a psychologist then, as I watched over and over, having nothing whatsoever to do with fire department or police department beyond whatever kinds of encounters I would have had with them growing up whenever they needed to address an issue near me. But watching over and over again, first responders, particularly firefighters, running into the buildings, never to be seen again. My heart broke in 1,000 pieces, like everyone else's did. But I guess you could say I was in a fortunate position because as a doctor, as the kind of doctor I am, I should say, there were ways that I could get involved. Medical professionals all stood by at their hospitals. And because so much of the devastation, there was very little carnage overall. Most people were literally burnt to a crisp. So there were either deaths but very few injuries. So medical doctors and nurses and dentists stood by with very little to do, and in utter agony about not being able to help. I was fortunate at the time to be attending NYU's postdoctoral program, and NYU is very much in the vicinity of where the towers fell. So their postdoctoral program in psychology found a way pretty quickly to connect with the counseling services unit of the FDNY. And then they created a program called Clinicians in the Firehouse together. Now, it was so chaotic. So many firefighters had perished. I believe it was at least 15% of the entire New York City Fire Department. There were 343 losses of firefighters that day. And there were 63 firehouses that had direct losses. So the way that clinicians like me were initiated into a firehouse in this sort of chaotic aftermath where people refused to, and understandably couldn't tolerate the idea that it was becoming a recovery mission versus a rescue mission. The difference being that rescue means there's a hope that they're alive, and recovery means that you're just hoping to find anything to give the family for peace of mind. So that transition from looking at it as rescue to recovery was kind of going on emotionally for firefighters who were up 24/7 down at ground zero, as we called it, climbing through the rubble in desperation, looking for their fallen comrades. So whomever answered the phone when someone from the counseling services unit called to say, would you like to have a clinician in your firehouse? Whomever answered the phone would either say yes or no. Mm-hmm. And that was the extent of our assignment. So apparently 62 houses had could have been even a random civilian who answered. Nobody knew. Right. But 62 of the 63 firehouses had someone that said, yes, sure. So from there, we were debriefed by a retired captain who came and explained to us the semi-military organization that the fire department is, but basically said, okay, you're a therapist. There are approximately 50 people in a firehouse, not necessarily at the same time, mm-hmm. but who work in a firehouse, whether they work for an engine company who anywhere in the world, an engine company has the hoses and puts out the flames, or a ladder company. Ladder companies have the large ladders. They do search, rescue, ventilation, and in big emergencies, the teams go together, but they usually live within the same firehouse or live and work while they're there. Mm-hmm. So when I entered the firehouse for the first time, I knew very little. And having to corral a bunch of grieving men who are also at work, so indeed need to maintain some level of stoicism mm-hmm. in order to conduct themselves, then having this, I'm going to call myself a girl, because mm-hmm. I was in my 30s at the time, and I weighed out all the different ways I could enter a firehouse filled with men. What would be the most sort of disarming way to come in there? Mm-hmm. And I realized it was as girly as I'd be comfortable being. Okay. So I donned a skirt and a nice top and some heels, and in I went. The communal place where firefighters speak to each other and hang out and sort of connect between tours, or in the middle of tours if there's not a call, is the kitchen.
Right.
So the brass, the officers of the companies in the firehouse that I was assigned to, which had lost 7 men the day of the on 9/11, they are located in on the west side, low down in the 30s, so which is maybe a half a mile away. So they were one of the first companies to arrive, and many people, because of the size, especially after the second plane hit, jumped on, even if their tour had ended and they were supposed to go home, they jumped on a rig, jumped on a truck to go down there to help out as best they could. It was an all hands emergency. So ultimately there were 25 people who left I call it my firehouse because I've been there for 15 years, and 5 who returned from my house.
Really?
So they were utterly shocked. I arrived maybe 5 months later, but it could have been 2 minutes later. It was taken seriously by the powers that be, that there was a doctor, a clinician coming into the firehouse. They sort of tried to tilt things in my favor by having it such that when I came to the firehouse, there were things that they didn't have to do during the time that I was there that they'd normally have to do, so that they could sort of, in theory, look forward to me coming if they didn't have to, for example, inspect hydrants that day, which is or even do a building inspection that day. So when I assembled everybody in the kitchen, the first major mistake I made was asking everyone who came in and sat around the table their names, where they were on 9/11, and how they felt.
All right.
As a group. That couldn't have been a worse clinical decision to make. Okay. It was like shining a spotlight on a bunch of people who not only were they in severe pain, but they also, especially, there was a sort of a hierarchy. It was guys who had gone down immediately after the first plane hit, and then there were guys who responded later in the day.
Right.
No matter what, everyone was severely traumatized, but those who had responded later felt not as entitled to their grief at that point.
Wow,
so it was a mistake. Yeah, it was a mistake to group them all together. So when the alarm sounded that day, and they had to go on a call, that was certainly something that I couldn't prevent with my presence. None of them came back to the kitchen after return.
And when you were working with them, I mean, you mentioned that conversation in the kitchen, or that question you put in the kitchen to them as a group. Have you also been working with them on a one-to-one basis and as
that was the day I learned from my mistake and everything changed. And from then on in, I realized that I was going to have to work in a very unconventional way, and that it was far more comfortable for me to, for example, grab a guy loop my arm through his, something that certainly you don't do as a clinician in your office. But I was going into their office, and I'd have to work with them in the oddest of places, whether it was the officers' quarters, their bedroom, or they had a nap room downstairs. Any private corner I could find, I would loop my arm through a firefighter's and just say, come on, let's go talk. So that their friends didn't think they were, because I was a girl, and I knew that was their first association. It sort of took away from the strangeness of being put on the spot. These were not guys that ever imagined they'd be in therapy, ever imagined they'd talk to a therapist. So there were so many aspects of this that changed me professionally to take the time to win them over by normalizing my presence as a sort of a supportive person first. I started going to the memorials of fallen firefighters, to picnics they'd have, to any event that was family oriented, which is also not a conventional thing to do as a clinician. So, but that was the way that I made inroads. First in the firehouse, and then later as they became more comfortable with me, I was able to have groups in the kitchen, but they were groups that the guys ran, basically. And what worked the best was not where were you, what were you doing? It was, what do you remember? Who did you see? Helping them piece together a cohesive narrative of their day. And each of them together could join in with each other to create that narrative, and that helped, and that soothed them.
Yeah, so it was a group attempt to work together to create a shared memory of what had happened.
It was all of it. It was a fluid experience of sometimes one person in an official-ish way of trying to spend a half an hour to 45 minutes. Sometimes it was riding on the fire truck and knowing that I better wait until after the emergency when we were driving back to start asking questions. It became an ongoing joke that it was having meals with them in the kitchen. It was luring them to my office. It was them finding ways to feel comfortable running into each other in the waiting room. There were so many aspects of that work, that aspect of my professional life that changed me. And I think in many ways helped me feel more bold about the kind of psychologist and therapist I wanted to be.
And I do want to come to that, Suzanne, and that is, how did that change you? But before we do, I'm interested, what I'm hearing is that you worked really hard to build trust, to create situations where the firefighters felt comfortable with you, around you, either as a group or one-to-one. Did it get to the point where they were on occasion seeking you out to talk to you, perhaps in a one-to-one?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. They knew, because it was so profoundly true, that it was an incredible honor for me to be able to support them any way that I could, and that it was also a collective grieving process. It wasn't just them. We were in it together. The more they knew me and the more I knew them, the more comfortable it all became, so that it became an easy, fluid, spontaneous experience where they would seek me out often. And I remember one time, because there were clinicians in many other houses, but many of them sort of stuck to a traditional way of working, which meant they found a place that was private within the firehouse they worked in, and they would announce they were there, and then they'd sit and wait for a firefighter to come to them. So I had taken a very different approach, and I remember once being on the fire truck, and it was a brush fire, and I got off the truck, and there was another company from another firehouse that pulled up, and here's this girl, dressed up, looking cute, and they're like, "Who's that?"
Mm-hmm.
And the guys go, "That's our therapist." And then I jumped back on the rig and off we drove.
So you were you were almost just one of the guys on shift.
Yeah, to this day.
Wonderful.
To this day, yeah.
And so tell us a bit about how it's changed the way that you practice with clients out with the firehouse.
I actually call them my people patients.
Your people okay. Your patients.
My people are patients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Clients doesn't feel like the right word to me personally.
Okay.
Because of the way in which I try to take care of people.
Right.
I think 9/11 in general, like anywhere thus far that has endured a terrorist act or a natural disaster, it changes you to the core.
Mm-hmm.
For many people who don't have the opportunity to talk about, to process, to share their traumatic experiences, it may become harder to feel comfortable or safe or happy in the world as life goes on. But being able as a clinician to have grieved and processed and continue to process the epicness of that tragedy has helped me be able to be open and able to handle the atrocities that my patients experience in everyday ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to put to words what their experience is because of the extensive emotional vocabulary that I was able to build for all those years and continuing to do with the fire department. But I spent 2 years working in the firehouse. And then after that, I had a sort of graduation out of the firehouse, whereupon I would go back and visit periodically. But it was no longer my official designation for firefighters. Mm-hmm. So then it became my offices, which it is still to this day.
Well, I'm interested, if I could jump in, because I am really interested in this, what you just said about you having this vast emotional repertoire as a result of that very intense, particularly that 2-year period where you're in the firehouse and you're working with men who've been through something that is more atrocious than most of us will ever experience in our lives. And the fact that you have that broad emotional repertoire and you're able to bring it into play in your practice with patients who are bringing their own issues to you, that must have been incredibly useful, because then those patients have a way of expressing how they feel. You have this shared understanding.
Exactly.
That's phenomenal. That just sounds phenomenal to me. That enhanced your ability as a professional to help them move through that.
Well, the majority of feedback I get on my writing is it's like you crawled into my brain and pulled the words out.
Oh my goodness.
So that's I get that a lot. Mm-hmm. So I know how much the constant talking with people and helping them put words to the magnificence of traumatic loss, and to be able to reconcile that there's only so much that you can put into words, and that's okay, because you or whomever, they can be reassured that we all understand that there are no words. As many words as we have, trusting that the person that you're sitting across from knows that you know that there aren't enough words. It's the process, it's the experience of feeling understood that is so powerful for people in feeling better from any kind of pain, whether it be trauma, depression, anxiety, whatever it may be. Being able to have words to put to it, and to also know that whomever you're entrusting with what's going on in your life or how you're feeling understands that it's bigger or worse than any words you can put to it.
You're almost minimizing it by describing it with words sometimes. That's what I'm
But since that's all we have, we've got to do the best we can. That I start out every session, and I don't think I would have done this prior to 9/11, but I start out, not every session, but with every new patient, explaining to them that no matter what they tell me about their parents, let's say, that at the lowest common denominator, because oftentimes when you're talking about somebody you love and you're saying things that aren't in the most positive light, you feel guilty or you feel disloyal, even with a therapist. So I'll say to people right off the bat that at the lowest common point, the lowest common denominator, I know, and they can take this as a given, that they couldn't love that parent more and that parent couldn't love them more. But that doesn't mean that things weren't messed up, and that doesn't mean they don't have reasons to process it or complain about it or whatever the case may be. But there's an unspoken understanding between us when we start.
And that's powerful because it gets rid of any guilt or any resistance to sharing and allows them that's the basic understanding. Then they can just share what they feel, and you just honor what they're telling you about their experience.
That's correct.
That's so powerful. I'm reluctant to move away from this, but I'm also conscious that we have to keep to time on the Inside Shift podcast. So from all that you've been through, is there a quote or a motto or an understanding that you would want to share with our listeners that you live by, that's been part of your shift?
Yes, without question. Knowledge is power, and self-knowledge is the ultimate power.
Yeah.
I learned so very much about myself that it helped me to be a vehicle for others. Yeah.
I can imagine, Suzanne, that 2 years in particular that you were in the firehouse, it must have been like holding a mirror up to yourself constantly as well.
Very much so. Being in relationships does that for people too. Any kind of relationship teaches you about yourself. It's how much you're willing to allow yourself to learn about your contributions that to the demise or the productivity of a relationship. Being able to, that's why knowledge is power and self-knowledge is the ultimate power. The more you can understand your role in something, the more empowered you feel, rather than sort of the victim. That's not, you're a part of what's happening rather than it's happening to you.
And I just want to underline that what you've just said is so immensely powerful and empowering that, anyone listening, please stop, rewind and hear that again. And you modeled that so well at the outset of this interview, Suzanne, when you said that you'd made the mistake when you went in on that first occasion to the firehouse by having the guys together and asking them, where they were and what, and just, you were so humble. There was no ego when you said, that's the worst thing that I could have done. I think that models so powerfully what you've just said. You learn from that. You move on.
Yes.
And
you grow from it. Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely grow from it. Now, I know that our listeners will want to find out more about you. And I also know I've read so many of your blogs. They're very powerful. You have blogs on almost every aspect of relationship. And I would recommend to listeners to go onto your website and have a look at those blogs and subscribe. So can you tell the listeners where they can find you, please, Suzanne?
Yes, sure. Dr. Suzanne L, it's Dr. SuzanneL.com is my personal website. I write for, I think you mentioned it in the beginning, Psychology Today, and my blog is called Me Before We. So you can find, I must have a good nearly 70 articles there in the archives and current on a range of topics, because basically you can ask me about anything and I'll talk about it. So I'll find a way. And I have a really lovely, wonderful, active community on Facebook. It's my professional page, Dr. Suzanne Lachmann, on Facebook, which I would love people to like and become involved with and chat with me on. It's quite interactive. And Twitter as well. It's at Dr. Suzanne L.
Wonderful. And if I can just add that those blogs, the 70 pieces, you've got great search function on the site. So don't be put off by the fact that there's 70, because there's a fantastic search function, and you can find exactly what you need, what you're looking for on that site. That's great. Suzanne, it's been a joy. It's been fascinating. And I really appreciate you joining us on the Inside Shift. Thank you so much.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks for listening to the Inside Shift podcast. You can hop on to energybell.com right now to download your free copy of The True You,